Good evening, my friends. Welcome to Read Me to Sleep, the podcast where I read softly to you, and, in tonight's case, speak softly to you to help you relax and drift off to sleep. I'm Victoria, and tonight I'll be trying something a little different. I'll be sharing my thoughts and some light literary analysis on the first 8 chapters of the Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, which we've been reading on the podcast. Now, while I do have a bit of an academic background in literature, I want to be clear that this is by no means an expert lecture. Think of it instead as the ramblings of a fellow book lover, reflecting softly on the words, the images, the moods, and the ideas that rise up while I read. My hope is that it feels both soothing and engaging, that it helps you relax, perhaps even drift off to sleep, while still giving you something thoughtful to rest your mind on. As always, if this podcast brings you a moment of rest, please consider supporting on Patreon for early access to new episodes and exclusive members-only content. You can also support by subscribing and leaving a like and a comment on YouTube and Spotify. All the links are in the description below. Thank you for joining me tonight. Now, let's settle in. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. One of my favorite things about this novel is the way that Oscar Wilde uses his delectable prose to weave this beautiful, dreamy, languid atmosphere where you immediately find yourself immersed. Just listen to the very first line of the novel. The studio was filled with the rich odor of roses, and when the light summer wind stirred amidst the trees of the garden, there came through the open door the heavy scent of the lilac, or the more delicate perfume of the pink flowering thorn. This is such a beautiful beginning for a novel. It's a pleasure to read it and a pleasure to fall into it. Oscar Wilde uses very sensual language throughout, and I use the word sensual here in terms of the senses. The way his descriptions engage our senses so that we see, hear, smell, taste, feel all the details of this dreamy world of beauty and decadence that he's painting for us. And it's obviously not just in the beginning that he does this. Throughout each chapter so far, he weaves his narration of the plot and the dialogue between the characters with lots of spellbinding and seductive descriptions of the beautiful, luxurious, decadent atmosphere that permeates the lives of these characters. Not only does this atmospheric writing transport us into this world of the story that feels like a fever dream of beauty and pleasure and decadence, but it also helps drive home that this is an important theme in the novel. Actually, as far as I can tell so far, they're the most important themes in the novel. Art, beauty, the pursuit of pleasure, and of course, morality, which comes up a lot in the dialogues and the inner worlds of the characters. And another thing that jumps out from the start at me is that these dreamy descriptions also serve to emphasize the wealth and status of our main characters. Over and over again, they reinforce that they're all wealthy, they're all of high rank, they're all beautiful, and they're all surrounded by art and beauty. This is the world that we're coming into. Near the beginning of chapter 1, when the narrator introduces us to the painter, Basil Hallward, as he's working on the painting of Dorian Gray, the narrator mentions Basil's sudden disappearance, quote, some years ago. And I'm not quite clear about the timeline of events. Like, is the narrator telling us a story that happened many years ago and foreshadowing that Basil will suddenly disappear in the span of the novel? And why does he so fleetingly mention this sudden disappearance of Basil? And then he doesn't elaborate about it at all, but he just gets back to narrating that moment in Basil's house while he's working on the portrait. It leaves me a tad confused, and it plants almost like a suspicious seed of anxiety inside me. Because the more I get into the story, the more I like Basil's character. I feel like he's one of the few genuinely likable characters in the novel. And there's a part of me that's cautiously waiting for the moment where something's going to happen to him. But of course, we don't know yet what that is, since we're only up to chapter 8 so far. Now, getting back to the themes of the story, the theme of vanity also comes up immediately and is there to stay. It runs through every chapter so far, and I suspect it's going to run through the entirety of the novel. When Basil tells Harry that he doesn't want to exhibit Dorian's portrait because he's put too much of himself in it, Harry tells him, "I didn't know you were so vain." Then, in the conversation that follows, Basil and Harry basically tease apart what they each mean when they're talking about art, beauty, and vanity. Harry tells Basil that the boy in the portrait, aka Dorian, is extraordinarily beautiful, and that Basil shouldn't flatter himself by suggesting that he himself is reflected in the portrait. But Basil clarifies that he doesn't mean that he's put too much of himself in the portrait in a physical sense. And here I admit that I'm not totally sure I fully understand what Basil's concern is all about. What exactly is the secret of Basil's soul, which he fears will be revealed if he exhibits the painting? Is it that he feels it's too transparent in how it reflects the way he artistically idolizes Dorian, and so it's too autobiographical for what he thinks art should be? Or, in a less philosophical and more straightforward sense, I get the sense that Basil's adoration and admiration for Dorian goes beyond the merely artistic and goes into romantic or at least homoerotic territory, which would have been taboo in Victorian times. And so he's got a very real fear that the devotion he's put into the portrait is too obvious and makes his feelings for Dorian too transparent for his liking. Something that I find interesting in the dialogues between Basil and Harry in the first few chapters of the novel is how they both have really strong opinions on what they think art should be. And I find it interesting because I personally really like literary theory and seeing it play out in literary works. And the Picture of Dorian Gray is truly a complex masterpiece of aestheticism. And please note that I haven't studied this subject super in depth, so I'm by no means an expert. This is my own very basic understanding of the theory, and my own sense of how the novel develops through that theoretical lens. So, aestheticism was a movement in art during the Victorian era, in the late 19th century, which is when Oscar Wilde lived and wrote. And aestheticism valued the appearance and beauty of art in all its forms over anything else. Victorian society at the time was all about something called didacticism, and what that means is that they felt strongly that art should have a didactic purpose, in other words, a teaching purpose, that art should teach moral and ethical lessons or make these moral and ethical observations about society. So, for example, Little Women, which is another novel that we're reading on the podcast, is known as a didactic novel because it was written to be a source of moral teachings for the reader. And you really get that sense while reading it, how the sisters are always concerned about their tendencies to be naughty or selfish, and how they're always striving to be good, and the way they always derive some sort of moral lesson from the things that happen around them and the guidance they receive from other characters. So that's didacticism, and that was the main idea of what art should be in Victorian times, celebrating utilitarianism and morality and ethics. And then here comes aestheticism, and it's like, hey, art doesn't need to be all about morals and ethics. Art should just exist because it's beautiful, and we take pleasure in beautiful things, and that's enough. The slogan, art for art's sake, pretty much encompasses the viewpoint. And that, of course, challenged the didactic idea of the times, with this notion that art and beauty are inherently valuable for their own sake, not for what they can teach us or what they can preach about society, and that the pursuit of beauty and pleasure is a valid way to fill one's life. So Oscar Wilde himself was a proponent of aestheticism. He was a key literary figure for the movement, and The Picture of Dorian Gray is one of its most important works. Although it is worth noting that the novel isn't just a blind endorsement of aestheticism, it also critiques it in a really complex way. And Oscar Wilde also was known for cultivating a life of beauty and pleasure, and he made his life a bit of a flamboyant spectacle. So we know that this is where the author is coming from when he wrote the novel. And it's really interesting to me to see the character of Basil struggle with the tenets of aestheticism in this really nuanced way. There is a moment when Harry criticizes autobiographical art. He talks about poets knowing how useful passion is for publication. And he says, "Nowadays, a broken heart will run to many editions." And Basil replies, "I hate them for it. An artist should create beautiful things, but should put nothing of his own life into them. We live in an age when men treat art as if it were meant to be a form of autobiography. We have lost the abstract sense of beauty. Someday I will show the world what it is. And, for that reason, the world shall never see my portrait of Dorian Gray." So through this exchange, we understand that both Harry and Basil follow an aesthetic perspective, and they both value beauty and believe that art should exist for art and beauty's sake alone. And yet, Basil feels strongly that art is ultimately a portrait of the creator, which is a contradiction to aestheticism. So, while he created a stunningly beautiful portrait, so he's got that beauty component of it down, he feels that he didn't manage to keep himself as the creator out of the painting. And that's a vulnerability that he's not okay with. In this book, there's a lot of the characters philosophizing about the nature of art and the interactions between art, beauty, the artist, the muse, the audience. Is art a portrait of the creator, as Basil says? In which case, is the initial innocent loveliness of the portrait a reflection of Basil's pure heart, more than a reflection of Dorian's loveliness and innocence? Or is art a capture of the subject? And obviously, centuries of philosophy haven't found a definitive answer to these questions, so I certainly don't have an answer to any of these questions. They're just the questions that come up for me while reading the novel, and I'm really looking forward to seeing if the rest of the novel will give me some more insights into these musings, or maybe it'll just give me more questions. In Chapter 1, we also get introduced to Harry's frankly insufferable epigrams. An epigram is defined as a pithy saying or remark expressing an idea in a clever and amusing way. And I did find Harry's epigrams clever and amusing the first few times, but after a while they started to wear on me, and the further I get into the novel, and the more we get barraged by Harry's little so-called witticisms, the more they just full-on grate on me now. In my opinion, and I say this with utmost literary appreciation because I do think Harry is a brilliantly crafted character, but he is just unbearably obnoxious to me with his cynical generalizations and paradoxes. From the beginning, Harry doesn't strike me as a genuine character, but rather as someone who's wearing a mask and always performing. He's always going on about how a normal, ethical life is overrated, and how an immoral life of self-indulgence is the only real way to live well. And yet, it seems to me that he's always talking a big talk from his elevated and very safe place of privilege, never actually having to deal with the choices and consequences that he's always on about. Basil, on the other hand, strikes me as a genuine and transparent character. He wears his heart on his sleeve, and he's also his own self. He's not afraid of standing up to Harry, and their friendship is in no way harmed by that. In fact, it seems like it amuses Harry, and he appreciates that dynamic between them. Basil tells Harry, "Your cynicism is simply a pose. You never say a moral thing, and you never do a wrong thing." In other words, he calls Harry out and tells him to knock it off, that he's all talk, but he doesn't actually live the decadent, immoral lifestyle that he preaches. I'm really interested in how the novel will continue to develop these ideas around beauty, pleasure, and morality. Harry says that beauty is incompatible with intellect, since he has this idea of beauty as this pristine, naive thing that is spoiled by deep thought or awareness. Remember when he says something along the lines of, "As soon as one thinks too much, one becomes all nose or all forehead"? Harry's an ironic character, full of contradictions, so it would make sense that he's kind of dismissive of intellectualism, even as he goes on and on philosophizing about things himself in an intellectual manner. Both Harry and Basil hold art as a superior form of expression. They talk about how words give a plastic form to formless things. That is to say that words can take the intangible and make it tangible. Basil says that there is nothing that art cannot express. And later on, when Harry's waxing philosophical to Dorian about his beauty, he tells him, beauty is higher than genius, as it needs no explanation. It's just a fact of the world. Both Harry and Basil agree that being remarkable in any way, whether appearance-wise or artistically or intellectually, or even socially, as with Harry's rank and wealth, that any kind of remarkableness will be a source of suffering for the person who possesses it. Basil says that the unremarkable are ultimately happiest because they don't suffer and they don't cause suffering. I also have to wonder if this is also foreshadowing about the ways in which Dorian will suffer and will cause suffering because of his remarkable beauty. And Harry also strikes me as a character who will first and foremost cause suffering, that's my prediction, but it also makes me wonder if he himself will suffer too, because of his remarkable status and influence. And Basil, who is artistically remarkable, I have such a soft spot for Basil so far that I really don't want him to either suffer or cause suffering, but I guess we'll see where this story goes. So those were all observations mainly from chapter 1, which I think does a brilliant job introducing us to this aesthetic world of beauty and pleasure and the high-status male relationships that will unfold within that world, all concerned with philosophies of art and life. Chapter 2, I think, delves more specifically into the topic of influence, specifically through the budding relationship between Harry and Dorian. When we're first introduced to Dorian, we understand that he's very young, and his character really strikes me as childish and bratty from the start, complaining about how he doesn't want to sit for the portrait, giving a moue of discontent, getting up on the dais with a martyr-like air. He's often described as sulky and listless and behaving in a petulant manner. He really isn't particularly likable. The only magnetic thing about him is his beauty, which we're made to understand from the start is absolutely arresting. But there's honestly not much else to his character, at least in these first 8 chapters. He's a beautiful but empty vessel of a boy. Harry muses to himself that to influence someone is to give him one's own soul. So then, the immediate question that arises for me is, as Dorian starts to adopt Harry's way of thinking, are we really seeing Harry's soul through Dorian's actions? Is Dorian really just being an echo of Harry throughout the story? I feel like the answer to this question is both yes and no. Yes, in the sense that Dorian does start to speak and act in a way that mirrors Harry's way of speaking and acting. Even other characters point it out. When Dorian makes a quip about how when one hears bad music, it's one's duty to drown it out with conversation, Harry's wife Victoria tells him immediately, that's one of Harry's views, isn't it? She recognizes it instantly as Harry's voice and influence. That said, before we ever meet Dorian, when Basil is telling Harry about him, Basil says that he thinks Dorian likes him because he flatters him often, but that sometimes Dorian is thoughtless and seems to take pleasure in causing him pain. This is the only glimpse we've gotten so far into what Dorian's nature was like before he met Harry. We glimpse it through Basil's perspective, and it suggests to us that Dorian was prone to cruelty and heartlessness even before he was under Harry's influence and started adopting Harry's brand of cruelty into his own character. Harry is actively manipulative over Dorian. Basil sees through Harry's BS in a way that Dorian can't. Perhaps because he's younger. Perhaps because he's somehow not quite at Harry's level the way Basil is. We understand that Basil and Harry were at Oxford together. Basil is an accomplished artist in his own right, and he's quite fully and confidently his own person, in a way that Dorian isn't. Again, perhaps because he's younger, and also perhaps because, even though he's wealthy, he may not quite have that Oxford pedigree that Basil and Harry share. Or he might, we don't know. The novel doesn't specify what Dorian's educational background is, but it makes a point to tell us that Basil and Harry were at Oxford together. Dorian is intrigued by Harry because he thinks he's revealing to him the mysteries of the world. And Harry does two crucial things during his first conversation with Dorian. He plants in Dorian a hedonistic seed, telling him the only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. And from that point on, Dorian's actions are often motivated by the pursuit of pleasure and experience. And secondly, he plants in Dorian the fear of losing his beauty and youth. For Dorian, the sense of his own beauty comes to him suddenly during this conversation, as if he never really had it before, as if he had never truly grasped his own beauty and the power that it holds, until Harry suggested to him that he would not always have it. And now he believes that when he loses his beauty and youth, he will lose everything. And his reaction to that realization is as childish and bratty as the Dorian that has been introduced to us. When Basil finishes the portrait, Dorian flings himself on the sofa and basically throws a tantrum over the fact that the portrait will never age, but he himself will. Like Victoria later on, Basil immediately recognizes this as Harry's influence and tells him, "This is your doing, Harry." Chapter 3 gives us a bigger window into Harry's character. We see him as this self-satisfied dude whose status and wealth allow him to move through the world at his own pace. He's extremely well connected, and he goes about his day flitting about his social circles, gathering information for his Dorian manipulation project, and indulging his ironic philosophizing with everyone who gives him the time of day. His epigrams and aphorisms are constant. The way of paradoxes is the way of truth, he says, suggesting that fundamental truths are contradictory, and so the way to really understand them is to push them to their extremes in order to reveal their true underlying realities, rather than just accepting more simplistic views at face value. And yet, so many of his epigrams are themselves pretty simplistic statements. In trying to wrap my head around Harry's character, I start to realize that maybe he's the biggest paradox of them all. The people he interacts with seem to fall on two camps: those who are shocked, captivated, or disconcerted by his outrageous musings, like Dorian at Basil's house that first afternoon when they first met, or the Duchess of Harley at Aunt Agatha's luncheon. And then there's those who see right through him, like Basil, who often tells him that he doesn't think Harry truly believes the wild things he says, or his Aunt Agatha, who tells the Duchess, "Don't mind him, my dear, he never means anything that he says." Over and over, people say that Harry's talk is just hot air, and Harry just kind of smiles to himself, and when people ask him if he meant what he said, or when they tell him to remember what he said, he claims to have entirely forgotten what he said. At best, it's just Harry confirming that he himself also considers everything that he says to be nonsense, not worth remembering. At worst, it's a big red flag in terms of his character's gross manipulative tendencies. At one point, at his Aunt Agatha's luncheon, when they ask him about the changes he would suggest to reform the things he's criticizing, he outright responds that he doesn't desire to change anything in England except the weather. "I'm quite content with philosophic contemplation," he says. It's like he himself is confirming that he's all talk. Starting in chapter 4, we start to get a deeper view into Dorian's character as he's developing under Harry's influence, and what the resulting creature is doing of his own accord all over London. We meet Sybil Vane and get swept up in her tragic story. When Dorian first meets Sybil, he finds her innocent and childlike, in the same way Basil and Harry found Dorian at the beginning of the novel. Sybil's story, I think, reveals to us the strong misogynistic undercurrent in the story, which up until now we had gotten glimpses of in the way the female characters have been portrayed, and how the male characters treat them or talk about them. The Picture of Dorian Gray, as a story, is basically immense homoerotic bromance, and women exist in this world not as full, well-rounded characters, but rather as objects of sexual desire and artistic appreciation, or as cautionary tales, vain, intellectually inferior, and ridiculous creatures that Harry especially takes joy in mocking and deriding them, even though he himself is as vain and self-indulgent as they come. I'm struck by Sybil being the first female character that we get a fuller view of her inner world, her hopes and aspirations. And we see how that fullness of character and experience clashes with the one-dimensional role that Dorian had in mind for her, with disastrous consequences. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the anti-Semitism in the novel, seen in the portrayal of Mr. Isaacs, the man who runs Sybil's theater. We know that classic literature quite often has racist undertones, or even overtones, really, because it reflects the social norms of its time, which was a time of colonialism and particular social hierarchies. So these works of literature often contain racist caricatures and stereotypes, and prejudiced views that were considered acceptable by the dominant culture at the time, but which we now recognize as harmful. In the case of the portrayal of Mr. Isaacs in the Picture of Dorian Gray, I wanted to learn more from English literature scholars who are much smarter and more educated than I am about what they have made of this character's crude and offensive portrayal. I found a really illuminating essay that explores this question, titled "The Problem of the Jewish Manager in the Picture of Dorian Gray" by Christopher S. Nassar, which was published in 2003 in the Oscar Wilde Society's journal, The Wildean. I think I said that right. I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. And then the essay was shared on the website, The Victorian Web, which is where I accessed it. And I will include the link in the description below for anyone who wants to check it out. It's a really interesting read. So in this essay, the author asks us to think about the Picture of Dorian Gray not only from an aesthetic or moral perspective, but also to consider how the novel engages with racial and cultural stereotyping at the time in Victorian England. Even though the novel is mainly known for its aesthetic lens, which is how I've been looking at it for most of this episode, Nassar encourages us to consider how racialized characterizations, like that of Mr. Isaacs, how they interact with that aesthetic world. Because Oscar Wilde is basically using Mr. Isaacs' character as an aesthetic device to highlight the lack of beauty and grace in the world of Sybil's theater. He's essentially using Mr. Isaacs to personify ugliness, which is such a wildly problematic thing. Nassar suggests that Oscar Wilde himself likely wasn't anti-Semitic, because he considers that there isn't any trace of anti-Semitism in any of his other works, and that Wilde was known to have been close friends with Jewish people in his personal life, even highlighting that during his trial and during and after his imprisonment, some of his most important friends who supported him and on whom he leaned on during most of those difficult times were Jewish. So, according to Nassar, Oscar Wilde himself was not likely to have held these prejudices, and Mr. Isaacs in the Picture of Dorian Gray is the only time where he portrayed a Jewish character in such a problematic way. And so he ponders that maybe what Oscar Wilde was doing was exaggerating anti-Semitic sentiment in his depiction of Mr. Isaacs to the point of parody, a way of calling out how problematic such a characterization really is by taking it to the extreme. All that said, Nassar doesn't exonerate Wilde for this, or even affirm that he was in fact parodying anything. He just says that it's a possibility, which he explores with some interesting evidence of the literary context of the time. I appreciated Nassar's essay because it shed some light for me on Oscar Wilde's background regarding this topic, as well as how the topic was addressed more generally in Victorian literature and culture. We know that Victorian literature, like a lot of classic literature, has a lot of problematic portrayals of cultures outside of the dominant culture. And it's always nice to know that the author that you're reading wasn't widely known for being prejudiced. But ultimately, the issue still remains around authorial responsibility and interpretive ethics. Even if Wilde wasn't himself prejudiced, he's not above criticism when his depictions reinforce harmful stereotypes and could be so deeply hurtful and offensive to readers. So this is a point that I'm marking in the story as one that doesn't sit well with me. Whatever Oscar Wilde's intentions were, his characterization of Mr. Isaacs remains problematic and unnecessary. From my perspective as a contemporary reader, that was super lame, Oscar. Do better. And again, if anyone wants to dive into a more thoughtful exploration of the problem, I'm leaving the link to Nassar's full essay in the description below. Now, going back to our theme of beauty, the novel constantly goes on about beautiful people and beautiful spaces, but there's an equal focus on people and spaces who don't quite manage to pull off beauty. Our main characters feel entitled to beauty, and they take any ugliness around them as a personal offense. When Dorian is telling Harry about Sybil Vane, whose name strikes me as a play on the word Vane, V-A-I-N, Dorian is a huge snob about her theater, first of all. And throughout the novel so far, Oscar Wilde has made a point of making perfectly clear that Harry, Basil, and Dorian are of high status, so that they stand in stark contrast to the poverty of Sybil and her theater. Poverty and a lack of sophistication and refinement are presented as forms of ugliness, which is something that Sybil's art and beauty manage to transcend at first, until they don't anymore. Later, after Sybil's dismal performance, Harry tells Dorian that her lack of talent can be overlooked because she's beautiful. I suppose they would probably consider that a lack of personal beauty can also be overlooked, as long as that person has talent, which is another form of beauty. But a lack of either, in other words, being unremarkable, is something that they absolutely detest. Even if back in chapter 1, Basil declared that being unremarkable is the happiest way to be. In chapter 7, when Dorian takes Harry and Basil to see Sybil's performance, Basil gives a quote that I think summarizes his definition of what art is, and I think it also foreshadows the direction that Dorian is headed under Harry's influence. And this is the quote: "To spiritualize one's age, that is something worth doing. If this girl can give a soul to those who have lived without one, if she can create the sense of beauty in people whose lives have been sordid and ugly, if she can strip them of their selfishness and lend them tears for sorrows that are not their own, she is worthy of all your adoration, worthy of the adoration of the world." In this quote, they're referring to the common people in the theater pit, who they look down upon from their theater box, both literally and figuratively. They see them through a dehumanizing lens. In fact, Harry is literally looking through his opera glass at them, and they see them through a dehumanizing lens as being quite separate from themselves, soulless creatures who lack the capacity to feel for others because they live immersed in brashness and ugliness. But I think that this passage actually shows us a glimpse of the direction Dorian is headed, living without a soul, a sordid and ugly life, steeped in selfishness and unable to feel sorrows that are not his own. It's interesting to see how they view Sybil as an object of artistic admiration rather than as a full person, and they hold her to the standard that they themselves aren't held to. Consider how they feel entitled to bask in Sybil's beauty and talent, and their resentment when she doesn't deliver on the talent front. It costs her everything. I appreciate that the novel gives us a deeper view into Sybil's inner world, since so far the only people whose inner world has been developed are Dorian, Harry, and Basil. Before Sybil met Dorian, acting was the one thing that was real to her, hence why she was such a good actress. It was her source of emotion. That was what connected her to her characters and brought them to life within herself. In a way, Dorian did to Sybil what Harry did to him. He took away the purity of heart and feeling that made her this ethereal creature, spoiling the whole thing. Meeting Dorian was Sybil's ruin, not just because he promised her love and marriage and then broke that promise, but because he replaced her love for acting with the fantasy of his shallow love. Dorian's true destruction of Sybil wasn't when he told her off and told her he couldn't love or marry her anymore, but rather when his interference in her life robbed her of her connection with her acting. When she's explaining to Dorian why her performance was so bad, she talks about how before she believed everything in her acting, the feelings of her characters, the common people acting with her whom she viewed as godlike. But now she thinks that Dorian's love showed her what truth was. She says, "I saw through the emptiness, the sham, the silliness of the pageant in which I'd always played." And it's quite ironic that these words she's using to describe her experience of the stage that night could arguably also be used to describe Dorian's feelings for her. She says that as she was acting that night, she realized that none of it was real, that the words she was saying weren't her words, weren't what she wanted to say. This strikes me as a mirror of Dorian's situation in a way. How long will it take him to realize the sham of the ideas that Harry has been feeding him? That Dorian's words after he meets Harry aren't his own, but Harry's. He briefly approaches the realization when he decides to write Sybil an apology letter the next day to keep his promise, but he falls back into Harry's false pageant pretty immediately. Sybil continues, "I thought I was going to be wonderful. I found I could do nothing." Is this foreshadowing Dorian's life as well? I'm really curious to see where the story goes, to see to what extent Sybil's character is completely foreshadowing Dorian's character arc. Harry talks a lot about how vacuous and stupid women are, yet I would argue that Sybil Vane's monologue about her acting and her love for Dorian and her view on the relationship between love and beauty and art is as eloquent and profound, perhaps even more so than everything that Harry and Basil go endlessly on about. There's an important difference between them, I think, in how, by necessity, Sybil's heart has to be in her art and her performance, because the only way she can act is on a stage before the eyes of her audience, and that makes her entirely vulnerable before the eyes of that crowd. The men, in contrast, are armchair philosophers, or in Basil's case, he does fully put his heart into his art, but then he refuses to be vulnerable with it before the eyes of the public. And Dorian, through all this, continues his childish behavior. Just as he whined about sitting for Basil, the way he flung himself down on sofas and buried his face to cry about the fact that he wouldn't be eternally young and beautiful. After Sybil's disastrous performance, he strides to the back of the theater box and hides his face against the wall to cry about his disappointment over Sybil's acting. Later, he flings himself on the sofa in the green room and turns away from Sybil after she's explained to him why her acting was so bad. He doesn't engage with anything she says. All he dwells on is how she's not the ethereal being he had imagined her to be. He can't stand not being given what he wants. And to that point, I think it's interesting to contrast Dorian's attitude with that of Basil, because Basil, from the very first chapter, has known that he's losing Dorian. And from the very first chapter, he's been begging Harry not to take Dorian away from him. And Harry has just totally disregarded that request. And it's made clear to us that Basil is heartbroken about this. He's definitely not getting what he wants, but he takes it with a maturity that Dorian's character doesn't have. Dorian tells Sybil how little you can know of love if you say it mars your art. But really, what the hell does Dorian himself know of either love or art? He tells Sybil, without your art, you are nothing. Yet Dorian, without his beauty, is nothing. Dorian tells Sybil that he's not acting, that he leaves that to her, suggesting that she's inauthentic and false. But actually, as I'm reading the Picture of Dorian Gray, I increasingly get the sense that it's Dorian who is constantly performing, rehearsing various roles for himself. You never get a clear sense of who he is, except for a beautiful empty vessel. Everything he does, it feels like he's just going through the motions. It's all performative and very dramatic. But so far there hasn't been any scene where Dorian has felt authentically himself to me. Except maybe the moment at the very beginning where he tells Basil that he must lend him the sheet music at the piano. But beyond that, nothing. And the other irony is that after the men at the theater have gone on and on about the wonder of the artistic ability to make someone shed tears for someone else's sorrow, Dorian is utterly heartless and lacks any sort of compassion for Sybil's sorrow. She's sobbing, and he's sneering at her, and he just thinks about how her sobs annoy him. Dorian is so cruel to Sybil, and I have to wonder, later on, will Dorian beg Harry the way Sybil begged Dorian? During this heartbreaking scene, when Sybil is begging Dorian not to leave her, Oscar Wilde masterfully weaves the image of beauty with that of disdain and cruelty. Dorian Gray, with his beautiful eyes, looked down at her, and his chiseled lips curled in exquisite disdain. This is the image that not only is perfectly visualized in our mind's eye as readers, but also the image that will be forever captured by the altering portrait, the first act of vicious cruelty to stain Dorian's soul. After Dorian leaves Sybil, everything around him is ugly, demonic, and hellish. Evil-looking houses and gaunt archways, women with hoarse voices calling to him, drunkards muttering to themselves, grotesque children on doorsteps, shrieks and moans. It's as though once he unleashed that inner demon through his cruelty, his surroundings are mirroring that. Also notice the use of the time of day to reflect on what's going on inside Dorian. It's nighttime when Dorian behaves cruelly towards Sybil, and the night is hellish. Come dawn, as the darkness lifts and the sky, quote, hollows itself out into a perfect pearl, Dorian starts to have some manner of self-awareness and realization of what he's done. It's fully morning when he decides to keep his promise, and an echo of his love for Sybil returns to him, surrounded by the fresh morning air and the singing of the birds. And then, by the end of chapter 8, Dorian loses whatever feeble thread of self-awareness he might have been developing, and falls back into Harry's web as darkness and shadows creep back into the room. Oscar Wilde also brilliantly takes us through Dorian's luxurious morning and afternoon, and juxtaposes his comfortable experience with Sybil's tragedy. Dorian sleeps in, has a delightful breakfast served to him in his luxurious home. We get a glimpse at his mail, which is bills for frivolous things and what is basically credit cards and invitations to all sorts of social events. Later that afternoon, Wilde makes it clear that Dorian's writing Sybil an apology letter is a self-indulgent act rather than a fully remorseful or selfless one. And after he learns about what happened to Sybil, Dorian continues on his merry, self-absorbed way, saying, "She would have kept me straight. She had no right to kill herself." So first she had no right to feel her love for him in the way that came naturally to her, and then she had no right to feel her pain, which was caused by him. She's meant to exist in his mind as a facilitator of his imagination and virtue, and nothing more. He was essentially looking in her for his manic pixie dream girl. At the same time, Dorian is so caught up in Harry's paradoxes that he doesn't see his own contradictions, which are increasingly evident. For instance, when Sybil told him that he had shown her the reality of love, he sneered at her. And yet, after her death, he's all about how she represents the reality of love for him. I suppose that in death she can exist as the icon he always wanted her to be for himself, rather than having to deal with the three-dimensional person she might have been in life. Throughout chapter 8, which is the final chapter that I'll be discussing in this commentary, Dorian struggles with the choice of whether to follow Basil's portrait, a sort of external conscience letting him know when he's been straying from a virtuous path, versus Harry's words encouraging the pursuit of pleasure above all else. Dorian is struggling between these two sources of guidance, and ultimately he chooses to pursue vices and pleasures and to let the portrait suffer the consequences. What could possibly go wrong, right? Thank you for listening, my friends. I hope this little literary ramble helped you find a moment of rest. And if you're not asleep just yet, I hope at least it was a gentle and interesting way to spend some time. Thank you for sharing your evening with me. Until next time, sweet dreams, my friends.